There was once, dear maidens, a girl who lived in a mill on the Sidlesham marshes. But in those days the marshlands were meadowlands, with streams running in from the coast, so that their water was brackish and salt. And sometimes the girl dipped her finger in the water, and sucked it, and tasted the sea. And the taste made storms rise in her heart. Her name was Helen. The mill house was a gaunt and gloomy building of stone, as grey as sleep, weather-stained with dreams. It had fine proportions, and looked like a noble prison. And in fact, if a prison is the lock-house of secrets, it was one. The great millstones ground day and night, and what the world sent in as corn, it got back as flour. And as to the secrets of the grinding, it asked no questions, because to the world results are everything. It understands death better than sorrow, marriage better than love, and birth better than creation. And the millstones of joy and pain, grinding dreams into bread, it seldom hears. But Helen heard them, and they were all the knowledge she had of life, for if the mill was a prison of dreams, it was her prison too. Her father, the miller, was a harsh man and dark. He was dark within and without. Her mother was dead. She did not remember her. As she grew up, she did, little by little, the work of the big place. She was her father's servant, and he kept her as close to her work as he kept his millstones to theirs. He was morose, and welcomed no company. Gaiety he hated. Helen knew no songs, for she had heard none. From morning till night she worked for her father. When she had done all her other work, she spun flax into linen for shirts and gowns, and wool for stockings and vests. If she went outside the mill house, it was only for a few steps for a few moments. She wasn't 2 miles from the sea, but she had never seen it. But she tasted the salt water, and smelt the salt wind. Like all things that grow up away from the light, she was pale. Her oval face was like ivory, and her lips, instead of being scarlet, had the tender red of apple blossom after the unfolding of the bright bud. Her hair was black and smooth and heavy, and lay on either side of her face like a starling's wings. Her eyes, too, were as black as midnight, and sometimes like midnight they were deep and sightless. But when she was neither working nor spinning, she would steal away to the millstones and stand there watching and listening. And then there were 2 stars in the midnight. She came away from those stolen times powdered with flour. Her black hair and her brows and lashes, her old blue gown, her rough hands and fair neck, and her white face. All that was dark and pale in her was merged in a mist, and seen only through the clinging dust of the millstones. She would try to wipe off all the evidences of her secret occasions, but her father generally knew. Had he known by nothing else, he need only have looked at her eyes before they lost their starlight. One day, when she was 17 years old, there was a knock at the mill-house door. Nobody ever knocked. Her father was the only man who came in and went out. The mill stood solitary in those days. The face of the country has since been changed by man and God, but at that time there were no habitations in sight. At regular times the peasants brought their grain and fetched their meal, but the miller kept his daughter away from his custom. He never said why. Doubtless, at the back of his mind was the thought of losing what was useful to him. Most parents have their ways of trying to keep their children. In some it is this way, in others that. Not many learn to keep them by letting them go. So when the knock came at the door, it was the strangest thing that had ever happened in Helen's life. She ran to the door, and stood with her hand on the heavy wooden bar that fell across it into a great socket. Her heart beat fast. Before we know a thing, it is 1,000 things. Only one thing would be there when she lifted the bar. But as she stood with her hand upon it, a host of presences hovered on the other side. A knight in armor, a king in his gold crown, a god in the guise of a beggar, an angel with a sword, a dragon even, a woman to be her friend, her mother, a child. Would it be better not to open, thought Helen, for then she would never know. Yes, then she could run to her millstones and fling them her thoughts in the husk and listen, while they ground them into dreams. What knowledge would be better than that? What would she lose by opening the door? But she had to open the door. Outside on the stones stood a common lad. He might have been 3 years older than she. He had a cap with a hole in it in his hand, and a shabby jersey that left his brown neck bare. He was whistling when she lifted the bar, but he stopped as the door fell back, and gave Helen a quick and careless look. "Can I have a bit of bread?" he asked. Helen stared at him without answering. She was so unused to people that her mind had to be summoned from a world of ghosts before she could hear and utter real words. The boy waited for her to speak, but as she did not, shrugged his shoulders and turned away whistling his tune. Then she understood that he was going, and she ran after him quickly and touched his sleeve. He turned again, expecting her to speak, but she was still dumb. "Thought better of it?" he said. Helen said slowly, "Why did you ask me for bread?" "Why?" He looked her up and down. "To mend my boots with, of course." She looked at his boots. "You silly thing," grinned the boy. A faint color came under her skin. "I'm sorry for being stupid. I suppose you're hungry." "As a hunter, but there's no call to trouble you. I'll be where I can get bread, and meat too, in 40 minutes. Goodbye, child." "No," said Helen. "Please don't go. I'd like to give you some bread." "Oh, all right," said the boy. "What frightened you? Did you think I was a scamp?" "I wasn't frightened," said Helen. "Don't tell me," mocked the boy. "You couldn't get a word out." "I wasn't frightened." "You thought I was a bad lot. You don't know I'm not one now." Helen's eyes filled with tears. She turned away quickly. "I'll get you your bread," she said. "You are silly, aren't you?" said the boy as she disappeared. Before long, she came back with half a loaf in one hand and something in the other which she kept behind her back. "Thanks," said the boy, taking the bit of loaf. "What else have you got there?" "It's something better than bread," said Helen slowly. "Well, let's have a look at it." She took her hand from behind her and offered him 7 ears of wheat. They were heavy with grain, and bowed on their ripe stems. "Is this what you call better than bread?" he asked. "It is better." "Oh, all right. I shan't eat it, though. Not all at once." "No," said Helen. "Keep it till you're hungry. The grains go quite a long way when you're hungry." "I'll eat 1 a year," said the boy, "and then they'll go so far they'll outlast me my lifetime." "Yes," said Helen, "but the bread will be gone in 40 minutes, and then you'll be where you can get meat." "You funny thing," said the boy, puzzled because she never smiled. "Where can you get meat?" she asked. "In a boat, fishing for rabbits." But she took no notice of the rabbits. She said eagerly, "A boat? Are you going in a boat?" "Yes." "Are you a sailor?" "You've hit it." "You've seen the sea. You've been on the sea. Sailors do that." "Oh dear, no," said the boy. "We sail 3 times round the duck pond and come home for tea." Helen hung her head. The boy put his hand up to his mouth and watched her over it. "Well," he said presently, "I must get along to Pagham." He stuck the little sheaf of wheat through the hole in his cap, and it bobbed like a ruddy gold plume over his ear. Then he felt in his pocket, and after some fumbling got hold of what he wanted and pulled it out. "Here you are, child," he said, "and thank you again." He put his present into her hand, and swung off whistling. He turned once to wave to her, and the corn in his cap nodded with its weight and his light gait. She stood gazing till he was out of sight, and then she looked at what he had given her. It was a shell. She had heard of shells, of course, but she had never seen one. Yet she knew this was no English shell. It was as large as the top of a teacup, but more oval than round. Over its surface, like pearl, rippled waves of sea green and sea blue, under a luster that was like golden moonlight on the ocean. She could not define or trace the waves of color. They flowed in and out of each other with interchangeable movement. One half of the outer rim, which was transparently thin and curled like the fantastic edge of a surf wave, was flecked with a faint play of rose and cream and silver that melted imperceptibly into the moonlit sea. When she turned the shell over, she found that she could not see its heart. The blue-green side of the shell curled under like a smooth billow, and then broke into a world of caves and caves within caves, whose final secret she could not discover. But within and within, the color grew deeper and deeper, bottomless blues and unfathomable greens, shot with such gleams of light as made her heart throb, for they were like the gleams that shoot through our dreams, the light that just eludes us when we wake. She went into the mill, trembling from head to foot. She was not conscious of moving, but she found herself presently standing by the grinding stones, with sound rushing through her and white dust whirling round her. She gazed and gazed into the labyrinth of the shell, as though she must see to its very core. But she could not. So she unfastened her blue gown, and laid the shell against her young heart. It was for the first time of so many times that I know not whether, when 20 years later she did it for the last time, they outnumbered the silver hairs among her black ones, and the silver by then were uncountable. Yet, on the day when Helen began her 20 years of lonely listening. But having said this, Martin Pippin grasped the rope just above Jennifer's hand, and pulled it with such force that the swing, instead of swinging back and forth as a swing should, reeled sideways so that the swinger had much ado to keep her seat. Jennifer. Heaven help me! Martin. Heaven help me! I need its help more sorely than you do. Jennifer. Oh, you should be punished, not helped. Martin. I have been punished, and the punished require help more than censure or scorn or anger or any other form of righteousness. Jennifer. Who has punished you, and for what? Martin. You, Mistress Jennifer, for my bad story. Jennifer. I do not remember doing so. The story has only begun. I am sure it will be a very good story. Martin. Now you are compassionate, because I need comfort. But the truth is that, good or bad, you care no more for my story, for I saw a tear of vexation come into your eye. Jennifer. It was not vexation, not exactly vexation, and doubtless Helen will have experiences which we shall all be glad to hear, but all the same I wish. Martin. You wish? Jennifer. That she was not going to grow old in her loneliness, because all lovers are young. Martin. You have spoken the most beautiful of all truths. Does the grass grow high enough by the swing for you to pluck me 2 blades? Jennifer. I think so. Yes. What do you want with them? Martin. I want but one of them now. You shall only give me the other, if, at the end of my tale, you agree that its lovers are as green as this blade and that. On the day, resumed Martin, when Helen began her lonely listening of heart and ears betwixt the seashell and the millstones of her dreams, there was not, dear Mistress Jennifer, a silver thread in her black locks to vex you with. For a girl of 17 is but a child, yet old enough to begin spinning the stuff of the spirit.
My boy! Oh, how strange it was, your coming like that so suddenly. Before I opened the door, I stood there guessing, and how could I have guessed this? Did you guess too, on the other side?
No, not much. I thought it might be a cross old woman. What did you guess?
Oh, such stupid things. Kings and knights, and even women. And it was you.
And it was you.
Suppose I'd been a cross old woman.
Suppose I'd been a king.
And you were just my boy.
And you, my sulky girl.
Oh, I wasn't sulky. Oh, didn't you understand? How could I speak to you? I couldn't hear you. I couldn't see you even.
Can you see me now? She was lying with her cheek against his heart, and she turned her face suddenly inwards, because she saw him bend his head, and the sweetness of his first kiss was going to be more than she could bear. Why don't you look up, you silly child? Why don't you look at me, dear?
How can I yet? Can I ever? It's so hard looking in a person's eyes. But I am looking at you. I am, though you can't see me.
Then tell me what color my eyes are.
They're gray-green, and your hair is dark red, a sort of chestnut, but a little redder, and rough over your forehead, and your nose is all over freckles, and very, very snub.
Martin. Heaven help you, Mistress Jennifer. Jennifer.
Why, Master Pippin?
Martin. Were you not about to fall again? Jennifer.
No,
Martin. I see you are as firm as a rock. How could I have been so deceived? He shook her a little in his arms, saying, How rude you are to my nose. I wish you'd look up.
No, not yet. Presently. But did you look at me?
Didn't you see me look?
When?
As soon as you opened the door.
What did you see?
The loveliest thing I'd ever seen.
I'm not really, am I?
I used to dream about you at night on my watches. I made you up out of bits of the night, white moonlight, black clouds, and stars. Sometimes I would take the last cloud of sunset for your lips, and the wind when it was gentle for your voice, and the movements of the sea for your movements, and the rise and fall of it for your breathing, and the lap of it against the boat for your kisses. Oh, child, look up. She looked up. What's your name?
Helen.
I can't hear you.
Helen, say it.
I'm trying to.
I can't hear you now, and I want to hear your voice say my name. Oh, my boy, do say it, so that I can remember it when you're away.
I can't say it, child. Why didn't you tell me your name?
What is yours?
I'm trying to tell you.
Please, please.
I'm trying with all my might. Listen with all yours.
I am listening. I can't hear anything. Yet I'm listening so hard that it hurts. I want to say your name over and over and over to myself when you're away. Can't you say it louder?
No, it's no good.
Oh, why didn't you tell me, boy?
Oh, child, why didn't you tell me?
Is my bread sweet to you?
The sweetest I ever ate. I ate it slowly, and took each bit from your hand. I kept one crust.
And my corn?
Oh, your corn. That is everlasting. You have sown your seed. I have eaten a grain, and it bore its harvest. One by one I shall eat them, and every grain will bear its full harvest. You have replenished the unknown earth with fields of golden corn, and set me walking there forever.
And you have thrown golden light upon strange waters, and set me floating there forever. Oh, you on my earth, and I on your ocean, how shall we meet?
Your corn is my waters are your corn. They move on one wave. Oh, child, we are born on it together, forever.
But how you teased me.
I couldn't help it.
You and your boats and your duck ponds.
It was such fun. You were so serious. It was so easy to tease you.
Why did you put your hand over your mouth? To keep myself from laughing at me?
Kissing you. You looked so sorry because sailors only sail round duck ponds when you thought they always sailed out by the west and home by the east. You believed the duck ponds.
I didn't really.
For a moment.
I felt so stupid.
You blushed.
Oh, did I?
A very little. Like the inside of a shell. I'd always tease you to make you blush like that. Don't you ever smile or laugh, child?
You might teach me to. I haven't had the sort of life that makes one smile and laugh. Oh, but I could. I could smile and laugh for you if you wished. I could do anything you wanted. I could be anything you wanted.
Shall I make something of you? What shall it be?
I don't care, so long as it is yours. Oh, make something of me. I've been lonely always. I don't want to be any more. I want to be able to come to you when I please, not only because I need so much to come, but because you need me to come. Can you make me sure that you need me? When no one has ever needed you, how can you believe? Oh, no, no, don't look sorry. I do believe it. And will you always stand with me, here in the loneliness that has been so dark? Then it won't be dark anymore. Why do two people make light? One alone only wanders and holds out her hand and finds no one, nothing. Sometimes not even herself. Will you be with me always? Always. Why? Because I love you. No, said Helen, but because I love you.
Tell me, were you frightened?
Of you, when I saw you at the door?
Yes, were you?
Oh, my boy.
But didn't you think I might be a scamp?
I didn't think about it at all. It wouldn't have made any difference.
Then why were you as mum as a fish?
Oh, my boy.
Why? If you weren't frightened. Of course you were frightened.
No, I wasn't. I told you I wasn't. Why don't you believe me? Oh, you're laughing at me again.
You're blushing again.
It's so easy to make me ashamed when I've been silly. Of course you know now why I couldn't speak. You know what took my words away. Didn't you know then?
How could I know? How could I dream it would be as quick for you as for me?
One can dream anything. Oh!
What is it, child? For she had caught at her heart.
Dreams, and not truth. Oh, are you here? Am I? Where are you? Where are you? Hold me fast. Don't let it be just empty dreams.
Hush, hush, my dear. Dreams aren't empty. Dreams are as near the truth as we can come. What greater truth can you ever have than this? For as men and women dream, they drop one by one the veils between them and the mystery. But when they meet, they are shrouded in the veils again, and though they long to strip them off, they cannot, and each sees of each but dimly the truth which in their dreams was as clear as light. Oh, child, it's not our dreams that are our illusions.
No, she whispered, but still it is not enough, not quite enough, for the beloved, that they shall dream apart and find their truths apart. In life, too, they must touch, and find the mystery together, though it be only for one eternal instant. Touch me, not only in my dreams, but in life. Turn life itself into the dream at last. Oh, hold me fast, my boy, my boy. Hush, hush, child, I'm holding you.
You wept.
Oh, did you see? I turned my head away.
Why did you weep?
Because you thought I had misjudged you.
Then I misjudged you.
But I did not weep for that.
Would you, if I misjudged you?
It would not be so hard to bear.
And you went away with tears, and brought me the corn of your mill.
And you took it with smiles, and gave me the shell of your seas.
Your corn rustled through my head.
Your shell whispers at my heart.
You shall always hear it whispering there.
It will tell you what I can never tell you, or only tell you in other ways. Of your life on the sea, of the countries over the water, of storms and islands and flashing birds and strange bright flowers, of all the lands and life I've never seen and dream of all wrong. Will it tell me those things? Of your life that I don't know? Yes, perhaps, but I could tell you of that life. Of what other life will it tell me? Of my life that you do know. Is there one? Look in your own heart. I am looking. And listen. Yes. What do you hear? Oh, boy, the whispering of your shell. Oh, child, the rustling of your corn. Oh, maids, the grinding of the millstones. This is only a little part of what she heard. But if I told you the whole, we should rise from the story gray-headed. For every day she carried her boy's shell to the grinding stones, and stood there while it spoke against her heart. And at other times of the day it lay in her pocket, while she swept and cooked and spun, and she saw shadows of her mill dreams in the cobwebs and the rising steam, and heard echoes of them in her singing kettle and her singing wheel. And at night it lay on her pillow against her ear, and the voice of the waters went through her sleep. So the years slipped one by one, and she grew from a girl into a young woman, and presently passed out of her youth. But her eyes and her heart were still those of a girl, for life had touched them with nothing but a girl's dream. And it is not time that leaves its traces on the spirit, whatever it may do to the body. Her father, meanwhile, grew harder and more tyrannical with years. There was little for him to fear now that any man would come to take her from him. But the habit of the oppressor was on him, and of the oppressed on her. And when this has been many years established, it is hard for either to realize that to escape, the oppressed has only to open the door and go. Yet Helen, if she had ever thought of escape into another world and life, would not have desired it. For in leaving her millstones, she would have lost a world whose boundaries she had never touched, and a life whose sweetness she had never exhausted. And she would have lost her clue to knowledge of him who was to her always the boy in the old jersey who had knocked at her door so many years ago. Once he was shipwrecked. The waters had sucked her under twice already, when her helpless hands hid against some floating substance on the waves. She could not have grasped it by herself, for her strength was gone, but a hand gripped her in the darkness and dragged her almost insensible to safety. For a long while she lay inert across the knees of her rescuer. Consciousness was at its very boundary. She knew that in some dim distance strong hands were chafing a wet and frozen body. But whose hands? Whose body? Presently it was lifted to the shelter of strong arms, and now she was conscious of her own heartbeats, but it was like a heart beating in air, not in a body. Then warmth and breath began to fall like garments about this bodiless heart, and they were indeed not her own warmth and breath, but those things given to her by another. The warmth was that of his own body, where he had laid her cold hands and breast to take what heat there was in him, and the breath was of his own lungs, putting life into hers through their two mouths. She opened her eyes. It was dark. The darkness she had come out of was bright beside this pitchy night, and her struggle back to life less painful than the fierce labor of the wind and waves. Their frail, precarious craft was in ceaseless peril. His left arm held her like a vice, but for greater safety he had bound a rope round their two bodies and the small mast of their craft. With his right arm he clasped the mast low down, and his right hand came round to grip her shaking knees. In this close hold she lay a long while without speaking. Then she said faintly, "Is it my boy?" "Yes, child. Didn't you know?" "I wanted to hear you say it. How long have you been in danger?" "I don't know. Some hours. I thought you would never come to yourself." I tried to come to you. I can't swim."
"The sea brought you to me. You were nearly drowned. You slipped me once. If you had again—"
"What would you have done?"
"Jumped in. I couldn't have stayed on here without you."
But you mustn't ever do that. Promise, promise, for then you'd lose me forever. Promise."
"I promise, but there's no forever of that sort. There's no losing each other, whatever happens. You know that, don't you?"
"Yes, I do know. When people love, they find each other forever. But I don't want you to die, and I don't want to die, yet. But if it is tonight, it will be together. Will it be tonight, do you think?"
"I don't know, dear. The storm's breaking up over there, but that's not the only danger."
"But nothing matters. Nothing matters at all while I'm with you."
She lay heavily against him, her eyes closed, and she shook violently. "Child, you're shuddering. You're as cold as ice." He put his hand upon her chilly bosom and hugged her more fiercely to his own. With a sudden movement of despair and anger at the little he could do, he slipped his arms from his jacket, and stripping open his shirt, pulled her to him, refastening his jacket around them both, tying it tightly about their bodies by the empty sleeves. She felt his lips on her hair and heard him whisper, "You are not frightened of me, are you, child? You never will be, will you?" She shook her head and whispered,
"I never have been."
"Sleep if you can, dear."
"I'll try."
So closely was she held by his coat and his arms, so near she lay to his beloved heart, that she knew no longer what part of that union was herself. They were one body and one spirit. Her shivering grew less, and with her lips pressed to his neck, she fell asleep. It was noon. The hemisphere of the sky was an unbroken blue, washed with a silver glare. She could not look up. The sea was no longer wild, but it was not smooth. It was a dancing sea, and every small wave rippled with crested rainbows. A flight of gulls wheeled and screamed over their heads. Their movements were so swift that the mid-air seemed to be filled with visible lines described by their flight, silver lines that gleamed and melted on transparent space like curved lightnings.
"Oh, look! Oh, look!"
cried Helen. He smiled, but he was not watching the gulls. "Yes, you've never seen that, have you, child?" His eyes searched the distance.
"But you aren't looking. What are you looking at?"
"Nothing. I can't see what I'm looking for. But the gulls might mean land, or icebergs, or a ship."
"I don't want land or a ship, or even icebergs,"
said Helen suddenly. He looked at her with the fleeting look that had been her first impression of him. "Why not? Why don't you?"
"I'm so happy where I am."
"That's all very well," said her boy, with his eyes on the distance. For a while she lay enjoying the warmth of the sun, watching the gulls sliding down the unseen slopes of the air. Presently, high up, she saw one hover and pause, settling on nothingness by the swift, almost imperceptible beat of its wings. And suddenly it dropped like a stone upon a wave, and darted up again so quickly that she could not follow what had happened.
"What is it doing?"
she asked. "Fishing," said the boy. "It wanted its dinner."
"So do I,"
said Helen. He put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a packet wrapped in oilskin. There was biscuit in it. He gave some to her, bit by bit. Though it was soft and dull, she was glad of it. But soon she drew away from the hand that fed her. "What's the matter?" he asked.
"You must have some too."
"That's all right. I'm not greedy like you birds."
"I'm not a bird, and I'm not greedy. Being hungry's not being greedy. I'd be greedy if I ate while you're hungry."
"I'm not hungry."
"Then neither am I."
To satisfy her, he ate a biscuit. Soon after she began to feel thirst, but she dared not ask for water. She knew he had none. He looked at her, lying pale in his arms, and said with a smile that was not like a real smile, "It's a pity about the icebergs." She smiled and nodded, and lay still in the heat, watching the gulls, and thinking of ice. Some of the birds settled on the raft. One sat on the mast. Another hovered at her knee, picking at crumbs. They played in the sun, rising and falling, and turned in her vision into a whirl of snowflakes, enormous snowflakes. She began to dream of snow, and her lips parted in the hope that some might fall upon her tongue. Presently she ceased to dream of snow. The boy looked down at her closed lids, and at her cheeks as white as the breasts of the gulls. He could not bear to look long, and returned to his distances. It was night again. The circle of the sea was as smooth as silk. Pale light played over it like dreams and ghosts. The sky was a crowded arc of stars, millions of stars. She had never seen or imagined so many. They glittered restlessly, in an ecstasy that caught her spirit. She, too, was filled with millions of stars. Through her senses they flashed and glittered, a delirium of stars in heaven and her heart. "My boy." "Yes, child." "Do you see the stars?" "Yes, child." "Do you feel them?" "Yes." "Oh, can't we die now?" She felt him move stiffly. "There's a ship. I'm certain of it now. I'm certain. Oh, if it were day!" The stars went on dazzling. She did not understand about the ship. Time moved forward, or stood still. For her the night was timeless. It was eternity. But things were happening outside in time and space. By what means they had been seen or had attracted attention, she did not know. But the floating dreamlight and the shivering starlight on the sea were broken by a dark movement on the waveless waters. A boat was coming. For some time there had been shouting and calling in strange voices, one of them her boy's. But once again she hovered on the dim verge of consciousness. She had flown from the body he was painfully unbinding from his own. What he had suffered in holding it there so long she never knew. From leagues away she heard him whispering, "Child, can you help yourself a little?" And now, for an instant, her soul reapproached her body, and looked at him through the soft midnight of her eyes, and he saw in them such starlight as never was in sky or on sea. "Kiss me," said Helen. He kissed her. With a great effort she lifted herself and stood upright on the raft, swaying a little and holding by the mast. The boat was still a little distant. "Goodbye, my boy." "Child." "Don't jump. You promised not to. You promised. But I can't come with you now. You must let me go." He looked at her and saw she was in a fever. He made a desperate clutch at her blue gown. But he was not quick enough. "Keep your promise," she cried, and disappeared in the dreamlit waters. She disappeared like a dream, without a sound. As she sank, she heard him calling her by the only name he knew. When she was 35, her father died. Now she was free to go where she pleased, but she did not go anywhere. Ever since, as a child, she had first tasted salt water, she had longed to travel and see other lands. What held her now? Was it that her longing had been satisfied? That she had a host of memories, of great mountains and golden shores, of jungles and strange cities of the coast, of islands lost in seas of sapphire and emerald, of caravans and towers of ivory, of haunted caverns and deserted temples, where, a child always, with her darling boy, she had had such adventures as would have filled 100 earthly lives. They had built huts in uninhabited places, or made a twisted bower of strong green creepers, and lived their primitive paradisal life wanting nothing but each other. Sometimes, through accidents and illness, they had nursed each other with such unwearied tenderness that Death himself had to withdraw, defeated by love. Once on a ship there had been mutiny, and she alone stood by him against a throng. Once savages had captured her, and he, outwitting them, had rescued her, riding through leagues of prairie land and forest, holding her before him on the saddle. In nearly all these adventures, it was as though they had met for the first time, and were struck anew with the dumb wonder of first love, and the strange, shy sweetness of wooing and confession. Yet they were but playing above truth. For the knowledge was always between them that they were bound immortally by love, which having no end, seemed also to have had no beginning. They quarrelled sometimes. This was playing too. She put, now herself, now him, in the wrong, and either reconciliation was sweet. But it was she who was oftenest at fault, his forgiveness was so dear to her. And still, this was but playing at it. When all these adventures and pretenses were done, they stood heart to heart, and out of their only meeting in life, built up eternal truth, and told each other. They told it inexhaustibly. And so, when her father left her free to go, Helen lived on still in the mill of dreams, and kept her millstones grinding. 2 years went by, and her hard, grey, lonely life laid its hand on her hair and her countenance. Her father had worn her out before her time. It was only invisible grain in the mill now. The peasants came no longer with their corn. She had enough to live on, and her long seclusion unfitted her for strange men in the mill and people she must talk to. And so long was the habit of the recluse on her, that though her soul flew leagues, her body never wandered more than a few 100 yards from her home. Some who had heard of her, and had glimpses of her, spoke to her when they met. But they could make no headway with the sweet, shy, silent woman. Yet children and boys and girls felt drawn to her. It was the dream in her eyes that stirred the love in their hearts, though they knew it no more than the soup in the pipkin knows why it bubbles and boils, for it cannot see the fire. But to them she did not seem old. Her strength and eagerness were still upon her, and that silver needlework with which time broiders all men had in her its special beauty, setting her aloof in the unabandoned dream which the young so often desert as their youth deserts them. Those of her age, seeing that unyouthful gleam of her hair, combined with the still youthful dream of her eyes, felt as though they could not touch her. For no man can break another's web, he can only break his own. And these had torn their films to tatters long ago, and shouldered their way through the smudgy rents, and no more walked where she walked. But very young people knew the places she walked in, and saw her clearly, for they walked there too, though they were growing up, and she was growing old. At the end of the 2nd year, there was a storm. It lasted 3 days without stopping. Such fury of rain and thunder she had never heard. The gaunt rooms of the mill were steeped in gloom, except when lightning stared through the flat windows, or split into fierce cracks on the dingy glass. Those 3 days she spent by candlelight. Outside, the world seemed to lie under a dark doom. On the 3rd morning she woke early. She had had restless nights, but now and then slept heavily. And out of one dull slumber, she awakened to the certainty that something strange had happened. The storm had lulled at last. Through her window, set high in the wall, she could see the dead light of a blank grey dawn. She had seen other eyeless mornings on her window-pane, but this was different. The air in her room was different. Something unknown had been taken from or added to it. As she lay there wondering, but not yet willing to discover, the flat light at the window was blocked out. A seagull beat against it with its wings and settled on the sill. The flutter and the settling of the bird overcame her. It was as though reality were more than she could bear. The birds of memory and pain flew through her heart. She got up and went to the window. The gold did not move. It was broken and exhausted by the storm. And beyond it, she looked down upon the sea. Yes, it was true. The sea itself washed at the walls of the mill. She did not understand these gray-green waters. She knew them in vision, not in reality. She cried out sharply and threw the window open. The draggled bird fluttered in and sank on the floor. A sea wind blew in with it. The bird's wings shivered on her feet, and the wind on her bosom. She stared over the land, swallowed up in the sea. Wreckage of all sorts tossed and floated on it. Fences and broken gates and branches of trees, and fragments of boats and nets and bits of cork, and grass and flowers and seaweed. She thought. What did she think? She thought she must be dreaming. She felt like one drowning. Where could she find a shore? She hurried to the bed and got her shell. Its touch on her heart was her first safety. In her nightgown as she was, she ran with her naked feet through the dim passages until she stood beside the grinding stones. "Child! Child! Child! Where are you, my boy? Where are you? Aren't you coming? Must I lose you after all this? Oh, come! But tell me where you are. In a few hours I should have been with you. A few hours after many years. Oh, boy, for pity, tell me where to find you. You are there waiting for me, aren't you, child? I know you are. I've always known you were. What would you have said to me when you opened the door in your blue gown? Oh, but say only where you are, my boy. Do you know what I should have said? I shouldn't have said anything. I should have kissed you. Oh, let me come to you, and you shall kiss me." But she listened in vain. She went back to her room. The gull was still on the floor. Its wing was broken. Her actions from this moment were mechanical. She did what she did without will. First she bound the broken wing, and fetched bread and water for the wounded bird. Then she dressed herself and went out of the mill. She had a rope in her hands. The water was not all around the mill. Strips and stretches of land were still unflooded, or only thinly covered. But the face of the earth had been altered by one of those great inland swoops of the sea that have for centuries changed and rechanged the point of Sussex, advancing, receding, shifting the coastline, making new shores, restoring old fields, wetting the soil with the sand. Helen walked where she could. She had no choice of ways. She kept by the edge of the water, and went into no man's land. A bank of rotting grasses and dry reeds, which the waves had left uncovered, rose from the marshes. She mounted it, and beheld the unnatural sea on either hand. Here and there in the desolate water, mounds of gray-green grass lifted themselves like drifting islands. Trees stricken or still in leaf reared from the unfamiliar element. Many of those which were leafless had put on a strange greenness, for their boughs dripped with seaweed. Over the floods, which were littered with such flotsam as she had seen from her window, flew seabirds and landbirds, crying and cheeping. There was no other presence in that desolation except her own. And then, at last, her commanded feet stood still, and her will came back to her, for she saw what she had come to find. He was hanging, as though it had caught him in a snare, in a tree standing solitary in the middle of a wide waste of water. He was hanging there like a dead man. She could distinguish his dark red hair and his blue jersey. She paused to think what to do. She couldn't swim. She would not have hesitated to try, but she wanted to save him. She looked about, and saw among the bits of stuff washing against the foot of the bank a large dismembered tree trunk. It bobbed back and forth among the hollow reeds. She thought it would serve her if she had an oar. She went in search of one, and found a broken plank cast up among the tangled growth of the bank. When she had secured it, she fastened one end of her rope around the stump of an old pollard squatting on the bank like a sturdy gnome, and the other end she knotted around herself. Then, gathering all the middle of the rope into a coil, and using her plank as a prop, she let herself down the bank, and slid shuddering into the water. But she had her tree trunk now. With some difficulty she scrambled onto it, and paddled her way into the open water. It was not really a great distance to his tree, but to her it seemed immeasurable. She was unskilful, and her awkwardness often put her into danger. But her will made her do what she otherwise might not have done. Presently she was under the branches of his tree. She pulled herself up to a limb beside him and looked at him. And it was not he. It was not her boy. It was a man, middle-aged, rough and weather-beaten, but pallid under his red and tan. His hair was grizzled, and his face was rough with the growth of grizzled hair. His whole body lurched heavily and helplessly in a fork of the tree, and one arm hung limp. His eyes were half shut. But they were not quite shut. He was not unconscious, and under the drooping lids he was watching her. For a few minutes they sat gazing at each other in silence. She had her breath to get. She thought it would never come back. The man spoke first. "Well, you made a job of it," he said. She didn't answer. "But you don't know much about the water, do you?" "I've never seen the sea till today," said Helen slowly. He laughed a little. "I expect you've seen enough of it today. But where do you live, then, that you've never seen the sea? In the middle of the earth?" "No," said Helen. "I live in a mill." His eyelids flickered. "Do you?" "Yes, of course you do. I might have guessed it." "How should you guess it?" "By your blue dress," said the man. Then he fainted. She sat there miserably, waiting, ready to prop him if he fell. She did not know what else to do. Before very long he opened his eyes. "Did I go off again?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes. Well, it's time to be making a move. I dare say I can now you're here. What's your name?" "Helen." "Well, Helen, we'd better put that rope to some use. Will that tree at the other end hold?" "Yes." "Then just you untie yourself, and we'll get aboard and haul ourselves home." She unfastened the rope from her body, and helped him down to her makeshift boat. "You take the paddle," he said. "My arm's damaged, but I can pull on the rope with the other." "Are you sure? Are you all right? What's your name?" "Yes, I can manage. My name's Peter. This would have been a lark 30 years ago, wouldn't it? It's rather a lark now." She nodded vaguely, wondering what she would do if he fell off the log in mid-water. "Suppose you faint again?" "Don't look for trouble," said the man. "Push off now." Pulling and paddling, they got to the bank. He took her helping hand up it, and she saw by his movements that he was very feeble. He leaned on her as they went back to the mill. They walked without speaking. When they reached the door, Peter said, "It's 20 years since I was here, but I expect you don't remember." "Oh, yes," said Helen. "I remember." "Do you now?" said Peter. "It's funny you should remember." And with that, he did faint again. And this time, when he recovered, he was in a fever. His staying power was gone. She put him to bed and nursed him. She sat day and night in his room, doing by instinct what was right and needful. At first he lay either unconscious or delirious. She listened to his incoherent speech in a sort of agony, as though it might contain some clue to a riddle. and she sat with her passionate eyes brooding on his countenance, as though in that too might lie the answer. But if there was one, neither his words nor his face revealed it.
"When he wakes," she whispered to herself, "he'll tell me. How can there be barriers between us any more?"
After 3 days he came to himself. She was sitting by the window preparing sheep's wool for her spindle. She bent over her task, using the last of the light which fell upon her head. She did not know that he was conscious, or had been watching her until he spoke. "Your hair used to be quite brown, didn't it?" he said. "Nut brown." She started and turned to him, and a faint flush stained her cheeks. "Ah, you're not pleased," said Peter with a slight grin. "None of us like getting old, do we?" Helen put by the question.
"You're yourself again."
"Doing my best," said he. "How long is it?"
3 days.
"As much as that? I could have sworn it was only yesterday. Well, time passes." He said no more, and fell into a doze. Helen was as grateful for this as she could have been for anything just then. She couldn't have gone on talking. She was stunned with misgivings. How could he ever have thought her hair was brown? Couldn't he see even now that it had once been as black as jet? She put her hand up to her head and unpinned a coil of her heavy hair and spread it over her breast and looked at it. Yes, the silver was there, too much and too soon, but there was less silver than black. It was still Time's stitchery, not his fabric. The man who was not her boy need never have seen her before to know that once her hair had been black. This was worse than forgetfulness in him. It was misremembrance. She pulled at the silver hairs passionately, as though she would pluck them out and make him see her as she had been. But soon she stopped her futile effort to uncount the years. "I am foolish," she whispered to herself, and coiled her lock again and bound it in its place. "There are other ways of making him remember. Presently, when he wakes again, I will talk to him. I will remind him of everything. Yes, and I'll tell him everything. I won't be afraid." She waited with longing his next consciousness. But to her woe, she found herself defeated. While he slept, she was able, as when he had been delirious or absent, to create the occasion and the talk between them. She dropped all fears, and in frank tenderness brought him her 20 years of dreams. And in her thought he accepted and answered them. But when he woke and spoke to her from the bed, she knew at once that the man who lay there was not the man with whom she had been speaking. His personality fenced with hers. It had barriers she could not pass. She dared not try, for dread of his indifference or his smiles. "What made you stick on in this place?" he asked her.
"I don't know," said Helen. "Places hold one, don't they?"
"None ever held me. I couldn't have been content to stay the best half of my life in one spot. But I suppose women are different."
"You speak as though all women were the same."
"Aren't they? I thought they might be. I don't know much about them," said Peter, rubbing his chin. "Rough as a porcupine, aren't I? You must have thought me a savage when you found me stuck upside down in that tree like a sloth. What did you think?" She looked at him, longing to tell him what she had thought. She longed to tell him of the boy she had expected to find in the tree. She longed to tell him how the finding had shocked her by bringing home to her her loss, not of the boy, but of something in that moment still more precious to her. Because, she longed to tell him, she had so swiftly rediscovered the lost boy, not in his face, but in his glance, not in his words, but in the tones of his voice. But when she looked at him and saw him leaning on his elbow waiting for her answer, with his half-shut lids and the half-smile on his lips, she answered only, "I was thinking how to get you back to the bank." "Was that it? Well, you managed it. I've never thanked you, have I?" "Don't!" said Helen with a quick breath, and looked out of the window. He waited for a few moments, and then said, "I'm a bad hand at thanking. I can't help being a savage, you know. I'm not fit for women's company. I don't look so rough when I'm trimmed." "I don't want to be thanked," said Helen, controlling her voice, and added with a faint smile, "No one looks his best when he's ill." "Wait till I'm well," grinned Peter, "and see if I'm not fit to walk you out o' Sundays." He lay back on his pillow and whistled a snatch of tune. Her heart almost stopped beating, because it was the tune he had whistled at the door 20 years ago. For a moment she thought she could speak to him as she wished. But desire choked her power to choose her words. So many rushed through her brain that she had to pause, seeking which of them to utter. And that long pause, in which she really seemed to have uttered them all aloud, checked the impulse. But surely he had heard her. No, for she had not spoken yet. And before she could make the effort, he had stopped whistling, and when she looked at him to speak, he was fumbling restlessly about his pillow. "What is it?" she asked. "Something I had. Where's my clothes?" She brought them to him, and he searched them till he had found among them a small metal box, which he thrust under the pillow, and then he lay back, as though too tired to notice her. So her impulse died in her, unacted on. Entering the next 4 days, it was always so. A dozen times in their talks she tried to come near him, and could not. Was it because he would not let her? Or because the thing she wished to find in him was not really there? Sometimes by his manner only, and sometimes by his words, he baffled her when she attempted to approach him. And the attempt had been so painful to conceive, and its stillbirth was such agony to her. He would talk frequently of the time he would be making tracks again. "Where to?" asked Helen. "I leave it to chance. I always have. I've never made plans, or very seldom, and I'm not often twice in the same place. You look tired. I'm sorry to be a bother to you, but it'll be for the last time, most likely. Go and lie down." "I don't want to," said Helen under her breath. And in her thoughts she was crying, "The last time? Then it must be soon, soon. I'll make you listen to me now." "I want to sleep," said Peter. She left the room. Tears of helplessness and misery filled her eyes. She was almost angry with him, but more angry with herself. But her self-anger was mixed with shame. She was ashamed that he made her feel so much, while he felt nothing. Did he feel nothing? "It's my stupidity that keeps us apart," she whispered. "I will break through it." As quickly as she had left him she returned, and stood by the bed. He was lying with his hand pressed over his eyes. When he was conscious of her being there, his hand fell, and his keen eyes shot into hers. His brows contracted. "You nuisance," he muttered, and hid his eyes again. She turned and left him. When she got outside the door, she leaned against it and shook from head to foot. She hovered on the brink of her delusions and felt as though she would soon crash into a precipice. She longed for him to go before she fell. Yes, she began to long for the time when he should go and end this pain, and leave her to the old strange life that had been so sweet. His living presence killed it. After that 3rd day, she had had no more fears for his safety, and he was strong and rallied quickly. The goal, too, was saved. He saved it. It had drooped and sickened with her. She did not know what to do with it. On the 4th day, as he was so much better, she brought it to him. He reset its wing and kept it by him, making it his patient and his playfellow. It thrived at once, and grew tame to his hand. He fondled and talked to it like a lover. She would watch him silently with her smoldering eyes as he fed and caressed the bird, and jabbered to it in scraps of a dozen foreign tongues. His tenderness smote her heart. "You're not very fond of birds," he said to her once, when she had been sitting in one of her silences while he played with his pet. The words, question or statement, filled her with anger. She would not trust herself to protest or deny. "I don't know much about them," she said. "That's a pity," said Peter coolly. "The more you know 'em, the more you have to love 'em. Yet you could love them for all sorts of things without knowing them, I'd have thought." She said nothing. "For their beauty, now. That's worth loving. Look at this one. You're a beauty, all right, aren't you, my pretty? Not many girls to match you." He paused and ran his finger down the bird's throat and breast. "Perhaps you don't think she's beautiful," he said to Helen. "Yes, she's beautiful," said Helen, with a difficulty that sounded like reluctance. "Ah, you don't think so. You ought to see her flying. You shall some day. When her hurt's mended, she'll fly. I'll let her go." "Perhaps she won't go," said Helen. "Oh, yes, she will. How can she stop in a place like this? This is no air for her. She must fly in her own." "You'll be sorry to see her go," said Helen. "To set her free? No, not a bit. I want her to fly. Why should I keep her? I'd not let her keep me. I'd hate her for it. Why should I make her hate me?" "Perhaps she wouldn't," said Helen in a low voice. "Oh, I expect she would. Ungrateful little beggar. I've saved her life, and she ought to know she belongs to me. So she might stay out of gratitude, but she'd come to hate me for it all the same. Not at first, after a bit. Because we change. Bound to, aren't we?" "Perhaps." "I know I do. We can none of us stay what we were. You haven't either." "You haven't much to go by," said Helen. 7 minutes at the door, wasn't it? This time it's been 7 days. "Yes." "It's a long time for me," said Peter. "It's not much out of a lifetime." "No. But suppose it were more than 7 days." Helen looked at him and said slowly, "It will be, won't it? You won't be able to go tomorrow." "No," said Peter. "Not tomorrow, or next day, perhaps. Perhaps I won't be able to go for the rest of my life." This time Helen looked at him and said nothing. Peter stroked his bird and whistled his tune, and stopped abruptly and said, "Will you marry me, Helen?" "I'd rather die," said Helen. And she got up and went out of the room. "Oh, the green grass!" chuckled Martin like a bird. "Nobody asked you to begin a song, Master Pippin," quavered Jennifer. "It was not the beginning of a song, Mistress Jennifer. It was the epilogue of a story." "But the epilogue comes at the end of a story," said Jennifer. "And hasn't my story come to its end?" said Martin. Jocelyn. "Ridiculous! Oh dear, there's no bearing with you. How can this be the end? How can it be, with him on one side of the door and her on the other?" Joyce. "And her heart's breaking. You must make an end of that." Jennifer. "And you must tell us the end of the shell." Jessica. "And of the millstones." Jane. "What did he have in his box?" "Please," said little Joan, "tell us whether she ever found her boy again. Oh, please tell us the end of her dreams." "Do these things matter?" said Martin. "Hasn't he asked her to marry him?" "But she said no," said Jennifer, with tears in her eyes. "Did she?" said Martin. "Who said so?" "Master Pippin," said Jocelyn, and her voice shook with the agitation of her anger. "Tell us immediately the things we want to know." "When, I wonder," said Martin, "will women cease to want to know little things more than big ones? However, I suppose they must be indulged in little things, lest—" "Lest?" said little Joan.
There is such a thing, said Martin, as playing for safety. Well then, my dear maids, when Helen ran out of his room, she went to her own, and she threw herself on the bed and sobbed without weeping, because everything in her life seemed to have been taken away from her. She lay there for a long time, and when she moved at last, her head was so heavy that she took the pins from her hair to relieve herself of its weight. But still the pain weighed on her forehead, which burned on her cold fingers when she pressed them over her eyes, trying to think and find some gleam of hope among her despairing thoughts. And then she remembered that one thing at least was left her shell. During his illness she had never carried it to the millstones. It was as though his being there had been the only answer to her daily dreams, an answer that had failed them all the time. But now, in spite of him, she would try to find the old answers again. So she went once more to the millstones with her shell, and when she got there she held it so tightly to her heart that it marked her skin. And the millstones had nothing to say. For the first time they refused to grind her corn. Then Helen knew that she really had nothing left, and that the homecoming of the man had robbed her of her boy and of the child she had been. Nothing was left but the man and woman who had lost their youth, and the man had nothing to give the woman, nothing but gratitude and disillusion. And now a still bitterer thought came to her, the thought that the boy had had nothing to give the girl. For 20 years it had been the girl's illusion. The storms in her heart broke out. She put her face in her hands and wept like wild rain on the sea. She wept so violently that between her passion and the speechless grinding of the stones, she did not hear him coming. She only knew he was there when he put his arm round her.
"What is it, you silly thing?" said Peter. She looked up at him through her hair, that fell like a girl's in soft masses on either side of her face. There was a change in him, but she didn't know then what it was. He had got into his clothes and made himself kempt. His beard was no longer rough, though his hair was still unruly across his forehead, and under it his gray-green eyes looked, half anxious, half smiling, into hers. His face was rather pale, and he was a little unsteady in his weakness. But the look in his eyes was the only thing she saw. It unlocked her speech at last.
"Oh, why did you come back?" she cried. "Why did you come back? If you had never come, I should have kept my dream to the end of my life. But now even when you go, I shall never get it again. You have destroyed what was not there."
He was silent for a moment, still keeping his arm round her. Then he said, "Look what's here." And he opened his hand and showed her his metal box without its lid. In it were the mummies of 7 ears of corn. Some were only husks, but some had grain in them still. She stared at them through her tears, and drew from her breast her hand with the shell in it. Suddenly her mouth quivered, and she cried passionately, "What's the use?" And she snatched the old corn from him and flung it to the millstones with her shell, and the millstones ground them to eternal atoms.
My boy, it was you over there in the tree."
"Oh, child, you came at last in your blue gown."
"Why didn't you call to me?"
"I'd no breath, I was spent, and I knew you'd seen me and would do your best."
"I'll never forget that sight of you in the tree, with your old jersey and your hair as red as ever."
"I shall always see your free young figure standing on the high bank against the sky."
"Oh, I was desperate."
"I wondered what you'd do. I knew you'd do something."
"I thought I'd never get across the water."
"Do you know what I thought as I saw you coming so bravely and so badly? I thought, I'll teach her to swim one day. Shall I, child?"
"I can't swim without you, my boy," she whispered. you pretended not to know me." "I couldn't help it. It was such fun." "How could you make fun of me then?" "I always shall, you know." "Oh, yes," she said. "Do, always." What did you think when you saw me in the tree? What did you see when you got there? Not what you expected. No, I saw 20 years come flying upon me, 20 years I'd forgotten all about, because for me it has always been 20 years ago. And you expected to see a boy, and you saw a grizzled man. "No," said Helen, her eyes shining with tears. "I expected to see a boy, and I saw a gray-haired woman. I've seen her ever since." "I've only seen her once," said Peter. "I saw her rise up from the water and sit in my tree. And when she spoke and looked at me, it was a child." He put his hand over her wet eyes. "You must stop seeing her, child," he said. "When I told you my name, were you disappointed?" "No, it's the loveliest name in the world." "You said it at once." "I had to. I'd wanted to say it for 20 years. But I shan't say it often, Helen." "Won't you?" "No, child." "Now and then, for a treat?" She looked up at him, half shy, half merry. "Oh, you can smile, can you?" "You were to teach me that, too." "Yes, I've a lot to teach you, haven't I? I've yet to teach you to say my name." "Have you?" "You've never said it once." "I've said it 1,000 times." "You've never let me hear you." "Haven't I?" "Let me hear you." "Peter." "Say it again." "Peter, Peter, Peter." "Again." "My boy." When we got back to the mill door, the last of the 20 years that had been melting faster and faster melted away forever, and you and I were standing there as we'd stood then, and I wanted to kiss your mouth as I'd wanted to then. "Oh, why didn't you, both times?" "Shall I now, for both times?" Oh, that's for 100 times." "Think of all the times I've wanted to and been without you." "You've never been without me." "I know that. How often I came to the mill." "Did you come to the mill?" "As often as I ate your grain. Didn't you know?" "I know how often your sea brought me to you." "Did it?" "And oh, my boy, at last the sea brought you to me." "And the mill," he said. "Where has that brought us?" "I thought perhaps you'd die." "I couldn't have died so close on finding you. I was fighting the demons all the time, fighting my way through to you. And at last I opened my eyes and saw you again, your black hair edged with light against the window." "My black hair? You mean my brown hair, don't you?" "Oh, weren't you cross? I loved you for being cross." "I wasn't cross. Why will you keep on saying I'm things I'm not?" "You were so cross that you pretended our 20 years were 60. "I never said anything about 20 years, or 60. "You did, though. 60. Why, in 60 years we'd have been very nearly old. So to punish you, I pretended to go to sleep. And I saw you take your hair down. It was so beautiful. You've seen the threads spiders spin on blackened furs that gypsies have set fire to? Your hair was like that. You were angry with those lovely lines of silver, and you wanted to get rid of them. I nearly called to you to stop hurting what I loved so much, but you stopped of yourself as though you had heard me before I called." "I was ashamed of myself," whispered Helen. "I was ashamed of trying to be again what I was the only other time you saw me." "You've never stopped being that, child," said Peter. "You knew, didn't you, why it was I had stayed on at the mill? You knew what it was that held me, and why I could never leave it." "Yes, I knew.
It held you because it held me too. I wondered if you'd tell me that.
I longed to, but I couldn't. I've never been able to tell you things, and I never shall.
Oh, child, don't look so troubled. You've always told me things, and always will. Do you think it's with our tongues we tell each other things? What can words ever tell? They only circle round the truth, like birds flying in the sun. The light bathes their flight, yet they are millions of miles away from the light they fly in. We listen to each other's words, but we watch each other's eyes.
Some people half shut their eyes, Peter.
Some people, Helen, can't shut their eyes at all. Your eyes will never stop telling me things.
And the strangest thing about them is that looking into them is like being able to see in the dark. They are darkness, not light.
And in darkness dreams are born. When I look into your eyes, I go into your dream.
I shall never shut my eyes again, she whispered. I will keep you in my dream forever. Women aren't all the same, Peter.
Aren't they?
And yet they are.
Well, I give it up.
Didn't you know?
No, I told you the truth that time. I've not had very much to do with women.
Then I've something to teach you, Peter.
I don't know what you can prove, said Peter. One woman by herself can't prove a difference.
Can't she?
Said Helen, and laughed and cried at once.
But why did you call me a nuisance?
You were one. You are one. You leave a man no peace. You're like the sea. You're full of storms, aren't you?
Not only storms.
I know. But the sea wouldn't be the sea without her storms. They're one of her ways of holding us too. And there are more storms in her than ever break. I see them in you, big ones and little ones, brooding. Then you're a nuisance. You always will be, won't you?
Not to wreck you.
You won't do that. Or if you do, I can survive shipwreck.
I know.
How do you know? I nearly gave up once, but the thought of you stopped me. I wanted to come back. I'd always meant to. So I held on.
I know.
How do you know? I never told you, did I?
Oh, Peter, the things we have to tell each other. The times you thought you were alone. The times I thought I was. You've had a life you never dreamed of. And I another life that was not in my dreams.
You've saved me from death more than once, said Peter.
You've done more than that,
said Helen.
You've given me the only life I've had. But a thing doesn't belong to you because you've saved its life or given it life. It only belongs to you because you love it. I know you belong to me, but you only know if I belong to you.
That's not true now. You do know, and I know.
Yes, and we know that as that belonging has nothing to do with death, it can't have anything either to do with the saving or even the giving of life. So you must never thank me, or I you. There are no thanks in love. And that was why I couldn't bear your asking me to marry you today. I thought you were thanking me. When you played with the seagull?
Yes.
How you loved it.
Yes.
I looked to see how you felt when you loved a thing. I wanted so much to be the seagull in your hands.
When I touched it, I was touching you. She put his hand to her breast and whispered,
I love birds.
He smiled. I knew you loved them, and best free. All birds must fly in their own air.
Yes,
she said,
but their freedom only means their power to choose what air they'll fly in. And every choice is a cage, too.
I shall leave the door open, child.
I shall never fly out, said Helen. You talked of going away.
Yes,
but not from you. Am I to go with you always, following chance and making no plans?
Will you? You are the only plan I ever made. Will you leave everything else but me to chance? Perhaps it will lead us all over the earth, and perhaps after all we shall not go very far. But I never could see ahead, except one thing.
What was it?
The mill door, and you in your old blue gown. And for 7 days I've stopped seeing that. I haven't it to steer by. Will you chance it?
Must you be playing with meanings, even in dreams? Don't you know? Don't you know that for a woman who loves, and is not sure that she is loved, her days and nights are all chances. Every minute she lives is a chance. It might be. It might not be. Oh, those ghosts of joy and pain, they are almost too much to bear. For the joy isn't pure joy, or the pain pure pain, and she cannot come to rest in either of them. Sometimes the joy is nearly as great as though she knew. Yet at the instant she tries to take it, it looks at her with the eyes of doubt, and she trembles and dare not take it yet. And sometimes the pain is all but the death she foresees. Yet even as she submits to it, it lays upon her heart the finger of hope, and then she trembles again because she need not take it yet. Those are her chances, Peter. But when she knows that her beloved is her lover, life may do what it will with her, but she is beyond its chances forever. Your corn! You kept my corn!
Till it should bear.
And your shell there, you've kept my shell. Till it should speak. And now? Oh, see, these things that have held our dreams for 20 years. The life is threshed from them forever. They are only husks. They can hold our dreams no more. Oh, I can't go on dreaming by myself. I can't. It's no use. I thought my heart had learned to bear its dream alone, but the time comes when love in its beauty is too near to pain. There is more love than the single heart can bear. Goodbye, my boy, goodbye. Helen, don't suffer so. Oh, child, what are you doing? Letting my dreams go. It's no use, Peter.
The millstones took them and crushed them. She uttered a sharp cry. She uttered a sharp cry. His arm tightened round her. "What is it, child?" she heard him say. She looked at him bewildered, and saw that he too was dazed. She looked into the gray-green eyes of a boy of 20. She said in a voice of wonder, "Oh, my boy," as he felt her soft hair. "Such a fuss about an empty shell and a bit of dead wheat." She hid her face on his jersey. "You are a silly, aren't you?" said Peter. "I wish you'd look up." Helen looked up, and they kissed each other for the first time. "I defy you now, Mistress Jennifer, to prove that your grass blade is greener than mine."